Blue dusk over the Colorado high country, the kind that settles into valleys like cold water filling a bowl. Snow covers everything: the road, the fences, the charred rafter stumps jutting from the top of a stone ruin, everywhere except inside the walls. Inside, the ground is bare, black. The air above it shimmers faintly, the way air shimmers above a stove someone forgot to close. A woman kneels on the dark floor with a tin kettle pressed against the surface. Frost melts from the rim in a slow ring. She lifts the kettle and stares at the steam rising from a place that should be frozen. Behind her, two children sleep under a quilt that is frosted on one side and dry on the other. 3 weeks before the sleet, before the silver dollars, before the closed door, Thomas Hale had still been alive. He worked the timberline in a drift called Number 7, which belonged on paper to a company in Denver and belonged in practice to his father's investors. The drift cut west under a mesa where the coal ran in a seam thick enough to stand in and thin enough to forget that standing meant trusting 60 feet of sandstone overhead. On the 4th of November, 1886, two ceiling timbers split along the grain, and the rockfall caught Thomas below the ribs. They carried him out breathing. He stopped before they reached the wagon. He left Alma no deed, no savings that the company store had not already swallowed. $31 of credit debt on a ledger in a building owned by the same men who owned the drift, and a promise spoken once at the kitchen table in front of Alma and Thomas's mother that Matthias Hale would settle things if anything went bad underground. What Matthias settled was the question of who owned whom. He waited 19 days, long enough for the funeral, long enough for Alma to wash Thomas's one good shirt and fold it into a trunk she could not afford to ship. Then Matthias sent Honora, and Honora brought a deputy, and the deputy brought a paper. Guardianship, one signature. Nell and Walter placed under the Hale household, raised proper, given the name and the stoves and the milk cow and the coal stacked to the shed wall. Alma could stay in the wash house. She could mend. She could eat at the short table. She would not make decisions about the children's schooling, their clothing, their mornings, or their prayers. Alma read the paper twice. She handed it back unsigned. The deputy looked at the floorboards. Honora looked at Alma's dress, which had been washed so many times the dye had gone the color of weak tea. Nell coughed against wool. Walter held his sister's hem because no one had told him to hold anything else. Honora said it softly, which made it worse. Which child will you leave first? Alma carried the trunk down the porch steps herself because the deputy would not touch it. 2 silver dollars sat in her palm, wet from the sleet that had started while she was inside. Matthias had given her the coins. Not kindness, severance. $2 in the road, and the knowledge that a woman with no land, no team, no relatives west of Missouri, and 2 children under 7 would come back. He was sure of it. She did not come back. The road to Langford ran southeast through mud frozen hard enough to hold boot prints, but not hard enough to hold a wagon wheel. Alma walked it with Nell on her hip and Walter gripping the trunk handle on the opposite side, his fingers too short to reach around the leather strap. The trunk held 1 flour sack with 9 pounds left, 1 coffee tin of beans, 2 quilts patched beyond the point where patching added warmth, Thomas's dull handsaw, a tin kettle with a loose bail, and the children's winter boots already too small. Walter's left boot had a crack across the sole that let water in with every 3rd step. She could not buy survival. A cord of split pine cost $1.20 in Langford, and hauling it cost another $1 without your own wagon. Coal was cheaper per pound, but controlled by the same families who attended the same church as Matthias, who nodded at the same men Matthias nodded at, who would extend credit to the people Matthias said deserved credit. A rented room above the hardware store cost $3 a month, and the landlord asked for references. Poor relief existed, but poor relief meant inspection, and inspection meant the same women who whispered about Alma's refusal would walk through whatever room she kept and write reports that Matthias could use to prove she could not provide. $2. 2 children. November in the Colorado high country, with the aspens already bare, and the first hard freeze 3 weeks away at most. Abel Quince found her at the edge of town. He was 64, a former freighter who had hauled ore in the years before the railroad made hauling personal, and now he served as elected poor overseer for the Langford district. He had a face like a feed sack folded in half, and he wore his authority the way old men wear suspenders, visible, functional, and too tight to forget. Abel did not start with sympathy. He started with inventory. "You have no woodpile," he said. He counted on his fingers as he spoke, the way a man counts nails before building a box. "You have no proper stove, no cow, no hay, no team, no legal title to anything except the clothes you are standing in and whatever is in that trunk, which by the look of the hinges will not survive another mile. A woman alone needs either kin, a team, or 6 cords stacked before December. You have none of those things." Alma asked him whether anyone had land they could not use. Abel almost laughed. He said there was no land in Langford worth having that cost what she could pay, and no land worth nothing that could keep a family alive. He said this without cruelty. He said it the way a man says the river is frozen, as a measurement of fact, not a judgment of character. But Alma had already heard the clerk at the county tax office joke about a listing no one would touch. A stone barn above an old coal prospect, burned sometime in the past decade. No roof, no road worth the name. 2 years of unpaid assessment on the books. The clerk said the land was worth less than the ink it took to record the debt. He said this while eating a biscuit, which meant he did not think the information mattered. Alma walked to the tax office with Walter dragging his cracked boot through the mud behind her. She paid $2 for a quitclaim scrap that gave her possession of a ruin on a useless strip of ground that smelled, according to the clerk, like the devil's own root cellar. The clerk stamped the paper. Alma folded it into the coffee tin next to the beans. Abel Quince watched from across the street. He shook his head once and went back inside. The barn sat above the road on a shelf of ground that had once been graded for a wagon turn. The walls rose from a foundation of rough-cut sandstone blocks, 22 feet by 38 feet, shoulder thick, blackened by fire but unbroken. The mortar had held where cheaper lime would have crumbled. The roof was gone. The rafters were charred stumps jutting from the wall tops like broken teeth. The doorway faced south, and someone had taken the door. Alma set the trunk inside the southwest corner, where the walls still stood full height. She lifted Nell down from her hip and told Walter to sit on the trunk. Then she looked at the floor. It was not dirt. It was black, glassy clinker mixed with old straw ash and something harder, fused rock that felt like slag under her boots. Snow lay against the outside wall in a clean white drift that reached the second course of stone. But inside the barn, the ground was bare. Not just sheltered bare, the way a covered porch stays dry. Bare in a way that looked wrong. The air above the floor shimmered faintly, like the air above a banked stove at dawn. The snow would not settle. It fell through the open roof and met the floor and disappeared. Night came fast in November. Alma stretched one quilt between 2 iron pins driven into the mortar, remnants of whatever had hung there when the barn held animals, and made a low tent over a door plank she found in the weeds outside the south wall. She put the children under the second quilt on the plank and told Nell a story about a cat who found a house, because Nell was 5, and a story was still stronger than cold. Walter fell asleep first. He was 3. He did not need a story. He needed his feet to stop hurting, and when they stopped, he slept. Alma did not sleep. She lay on the edge of the plank with her boots still on, because a woman who removed her boots in an open ruin in November was a woman who trusted the night, and Alma had stopped trusting anything that did not have a hinge or a handle. She woke because her feet were warm, not hot, not the sharp heat of a coal that has rolled from a stove. A low, steady warmth that came through the sole of her boot the way sunlight comes through a window, present before you notice it, and then undeniable. She sat up. The quilt tent had frosted on the outside where it faced the open roof, but the underside, the side nearest the floor, was dry. Alma pressed the kettle bottom against the clinker. Frost on the rim melted in a slow ring that dripped onto the black surface and steamed. Not boiling steam, a faint curl of vapor, the kind that rises from bread taken out too soon. She did not know the words, coal seam fire. She did not know that underground coal could burn for decades without flame or light, feeding on air that crept through fractures in the rock, releasing heat upward through stone and soil the way a kiln releases heat through brick long after the fire is drawn. She did not know that the barn had burned because the coal beneath it had found a vent, and the vent had found the straw, and the straw had found the rafters. What she knew was her father. In St. Louis, before the cough took him, her father had worked a brick kiln on the south end of the rail yard. He made common brick, nothing fine, nothing architectural, but he understood heat the way a carpenter understands grain. He had taken Alma's hand when she was younger than Nell and pressed it near the kiln wall a full day after the fire had been drawn. "Feel that," he said. "The brick gives back what it has given. It just takes its time." Alma pressed her palm flat against the barn floor. The clinker was warm. The stone foundation near the floor was warm. The wall, up to about her hip, held a faint stored heat that faded the higher she reached. The floor was giving back what it had been given by a fire no one could see. She did not sleep again that night. She sat with her back against the warm stone and watched snow fall through the open roof and vanish before it reached her children. By morning, Alma had marked 4 spots on the floor with broken crockery she found in a heap near the doorway. Center of the barn. North wall base, east corner, doorway threshold. She watched frost. The center spot cleared first. The doorway held frost longest because the open south face let cold air pour across the threshold like water through a flume. She threw a handful of snow onto the center floor. It did not melt instantly. It sat for a count of 3, then softened, then steamed faintly, and was gone. She buried a potato in a tin cup and pushed the cup into a crack near the center. After an hour, the potato was warm enough to eat. Miriam Coe arrived at mid-morning with a heel of bread and a face that said she had come to confirm the gossip. Miriam was 37, a widow herself, and she washed other people's laundry for 15 cents a bundle because widowhood in Langford meant either remarriage or work that did not require owning anything. She had a daughter named Eula and a reputation for speaking plainly, which in a small town meant she was respected by women and tolerated by men. She looked at the children on the plank. She looked at the quilt tent and the trunk with the cracked hinge and the 9 pounds of flour that was now closer to 8. Then she looked at the floor and felt what Alma had felt. "Warm dirt is not a house," Miriam said. Alma did not argue. Miriam pressed further. She crouched and held her palm to the floor, and her face changed the way a face changes when something familiar suddenly is not. She said the warmth could mean gas. She said coal ground was known to open without warning, swallowing sheds and fences and sometimes animals. She said smoke meant fire, and fire under a floor meant no floor, and children on a floor that might not exist tomorrow was not a plan. It was a prayer. These were the doubts the children's breathing made irrelevant. Alma tested instead of debating. She explained nothing. She showed the 4 crockery markers. She showed the frost pattern. She showed the potato. She picked up the tin cup and held it toward Miriam, and the warmth rose from the cup the way warmth rises from a hand held near a lamp. Miriam ate the bread she had brought for Alma. She did this without realizing it, which meant she was thinking. "You need someone who knows Cole," Miriam said. Then she left. She did not offer her house. She did not offer more bread. But she did not tell Alma to leave the barn, and in Langford that November not being told to leave was the closest thing to welcome. Alma began thinking of the barn, not as shelter, but as a source. The walls were a kiln that someone had loaded and fired and abandoned. The ground was a stove that no one had built and no one could extinguish. The question was not whether the heat existed. The question was whether she could live above it without it killing her. Her first design took shape not on paper, but in action. She needed the stone walls preserved because they held heat at the base and blocked wind. She needed the sleeping floor raised off the hottest ground so the children did not lie directly over the buried fire, 6 inches at least, on flat rock and clay brick fragments she could find in the rubble. She needed a roof that admitted light, because a dark stone room in winter would crush the mind even if it warmed the body. She needed ventilation because her father had told her once that a kiln without a draw bakes its own poison. And she needed someone who understood what happened when coal burned where no one could reach it. The design was not a house. It was a negotiation with a fire she could not see and could not stop. The walls would hold the heat. The glass would hold the light. The vents would hold the air clean, and the raised floor would hold her children above the line where warmth became danger. The risk was plain enough that she did not need Miriam to say it. If the coal beneath the floor shifted, or the ground opened, or the air turned, the barn would become a kiln with her family inside it. She was gambling 2 children on the memory of a dead man's hand against a warm wall. She had no other bet to make. The town's first verdict came at Brackett's store, 4 days after Alma filed the quitclaim. She had walked to town carrying Thomas's watch chain, nickel silver, not real silver, but polished enough to pass in lamplight, hoping to trade it for nails. She needed nails the way a surgeon needs thread, not for beauty, but to hold things where they had to stay. The men around the stove at Brackett's had already heard. News in Langford moved at the speed of boredom, which was faster than telegraph. Someone said the widow Hale had bought the burned barn above the old prospect. Someone else said the last owner's horses would not go inside. A third man, older, said the barn had caught fire in dry weather with no lightning strike and no lantern found, and that the ground up there smelled like a forge in August. The Devil's Cow Shed, someone called it, and the name stuck to the laughter like soot sticks to lime. Brackett himself, a square man who sold everything from harness rings to headache powder, looked at the watch chain and offered 4 cents. Alma asked for nails instead. Brackett gave her 9 nails and did not wrap them, which was his way of saying the transaction embarrassed him. The mockery sounded reasonable. That was what made it dangerous. To anyone who did not know about the warm floor or the crockery markers or the potato in the tin cup, Alma was a grieving woman dragging her children into a burned ruin over ground that smelled like sulfur. The men at the stove were not villains. They were practical people with stoves that worked and roofs that held, and the ordinary certainty that what they had was what survival looked like. A woman who chose a ruin over charity was not brave in their accounting. She was broken. The gossip hardened into verdict before Alma reached the road. By the time she passed the schoolhouse, the teacher had already heard. By evening, Miriam told her that 2 women at the wash line had said Alma was unfit and that someone should write to the county. Matthias Hale did not wait for the county. He rode to the barn on the sixth day, November 26th, on a horse that cost more than everything Alma had ever owned combined. He found her scraping soot from the interior south wall with a flat stone. She was scraping because she had noticed the soot was thickest where the fire had vented upward, and the pattern told her where the heat moved fastest through the stone. She was reading the walls the way her father read kiln brick by the marks the fire left behind. Matthias did not dismount. He spoke from the saddle because the saddle was higher than where Alma stood, and height was the only language he trusted after money. "You bought a grave with my son's name on it," he said. Alma kept scraping. Matthias told her the children would be sick within the week. He said the ground was rotten, and the walls were rotten, and the air was rotten, and that a woman who could not recognize rot had no business raising children who shared his family's name. He said he had spoken to Abel Quince, and Abel agreed that the barn was not fit. He said he would receive the children when hunger softened her, and that he hoped it would be soon because the cold was coming and he was not a patient man. Alma did not defend the purchase. She did not explain the warm floor or the crockery test or the potato or the design taking shape in her head. She kept scraping. The flat stone rasped against the blackened surface with a sound like a boot on gravel, steady and deliberate, and Matthias sat above her in the saddle and heard only stubbornness where there was calculation. He said one more thing before he turned the horse. He said Honora had kept Nell's christening dress, and that when the time came, he wanted Alma to know the children would be received properly. A christening dress for a child who was alive and coughing in a quilt 6 feet away. Alma scraped until the stone in her hand wore smooth. Then she found another stone and kept scraping. Miriam Coe pulled back. She did not stop coming entirely. She left a turnip on the wall top one morning, wrapped in a rag, but she stopped entering the barn. The gas rumors had reached her, and Miriam was a woman who calculated risk the way she calculated wash loads, by weight and temperature and what would come out ruined. Her daughter Eula had a cough that came each winter, and Miriam could not afford to bring Eula near anything that might add to it. The store refused Alma credit. This was Matthias's reach, invisible but absolute, the way a fence is invisible to a bird until the bird tries to land. The school teacher hesitated to let Nell sit near the other children because the girl smelled of smoke and something sharper, the coal rot smell that clung to anyone who spent time above the seam. Nell sat at the end of the bench nearest the door, where the draft was worst because the draft was preferable to the smell. Alma was becoming a stone in the current. The town flowed around her without touching, and winter was 8 days closer than when she had started. Rowan Price appeared on the 12th day, and he appeared because Alma made a mistake that could have killed her. She had found a crack in the northeast corner of the barn floor, a fissure no wider than a thumb, running diagonally from the wall base toward the center. Warm vapor rose from it in a thin line, visible in the morning cold the way breath is visible. The vapor smelled like rotten eggs and hot iron. Alma knew enough to know the smell was wrong. She did not know enough to know what wrong meant. She mixed clay from the creek bank with water and packed the crack shut. She pressed it tight with the heel of her boot and smoothed it flat with the back of the handsaw, and she thought she had fixed something. The tap of a cane on stone made her turn. A man stood in the doorway, leaning on a blackthorn stick that had been worn to the color of old tea. He was 59, broad through the shoulders, but narrowed by something, age or injury or both, so that he stood the way a door stands when one hinge is gone, upright but not quite square. His left leg dragged slightly. His coat was Welsh wool, patched at the elbows with leather that did not match. His hands were the hands of a man who had worked underground, short-nailed, scarred across the knuckles, and permanently darkened in the creases where no amount of lye soap could reach. Rowan Price had come to Colorado from the Rhonda Valley in 1871 to work coal. He had worked it for 14 years before a roof fall in the Empire mine broke his left hip and filled his lungs with the powder that would eventually kill him. He walked with the cane because the hip had healed crooked, and he coughed in the mornings because the powder had not healed at all. He had been a colliery mason, the man who built the walls inside a mine, the brattice walls that directed air, the stoppings that sealed abandoned passages, the vent channels that kept methane from pooling in the places where men worked with open flame. He had also been a fire hand. Twice in Wales and once in Colorado, he had been called to seal and vent mine fires, the slow underground burns that could swallow a working in weeks if the air found a path and the coal had a mind to take it. He knocked Alma's clay patch loose with one strike of the cane. "Do that wrong," he said, "and the fire finds its own chimney, maybe through your bed." Alma did not step back. She looked at the crack, now open again, the warm vapor curling up between them. Rowan looked at her the way a man looks at a wall he is deciding whether to shore up or abandon. He saw the crockery markers on the floor. He saw that the children's plank was raised on flat rocks away from the hottest center ground. He saw that the doorway was propped open with a stone, not sealed, which meant the woman understood, even if she did not know the words, that a closed space over burning coal was a coffin. He did not see helplessness. He saw someone working a problem with the wrong tools and the right instinct. "You have mapped the floor," he said. It was not a question. Alma pointed to the 4 markers. She told him center was warmest, doorway was coldest, northeast corner vented something that smelled bad. Rowan tapped his cane against the northeast crack. "That is your biggest friend and your biggest enemy in the same hole," he said. "That is where the fire breathes. Block it, and the fire suffocates or finds another way out, and you do not choose which. Leave it open, and the fire draws clean, but you get the gas with it unless you give the gas somewhere to go. That is not where your children sleep." He looked at her again. "Not at the barn." At her. "You mend?" he asked. Alma said she mended. Rowan held out his coat. The right elbow had split along the seam. He said if she mended it and cooked whatever beans she had in that tin, he would show her how to read the floor without killing herself. He said this the way a man offers a trade at a counter, with the price set and the merchandise visible. Alma took the coat. The wool was heavy and smelled of pipe tobacco and the sour mineral tang of old mine dust. She threaded Thomas's mending needle while Rowan lowered himself onto the plank beside Walter, who was asleep, and began to talk about air. The first lesson was not about heat. It was about breath. Rowan had Alma find 12 willow stakes from the creek bank, thin, flexible, the length of a forearm, and drive them into cracks and seams around the barn floor and wall base. To each stake she tied a short length of wool thread pulled from the hem of the damaged quilt. The threads hung limp at first. Then, as the morning warmed the floor and the air above it began to move, the threads stirred. Some pulled toward the northeast crack. Others pulled toward the doorway. 2, near the south wall base, pulled inward, toward the center. Rowan pointed. "Those are your intakes," he said. "That is where cold air enters." He pointed to the northeast threads. "That is your exhaust. The fire draws air in from the low sides and pushes it out through the crack where you just packed your clay. You sealed the chimney. The smoke had nowhere to go except up through the floor, through the gaps in the stone, through the space where your children breathe." Alma looked at the threads. They moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, like grass in water. "Heat without a path," Rowan said, "is not warmth. It is pressure. Give it a road, or it makes its own." He coughed. The cough came from deep in his chest and sounded like gravel turning in a bucket. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked at the damp on his skin and said nothing about it. Alma finished the elbow seam and handed the coat back. Rowan stood, leaned on the cane, and told her they would start tomorrow on the vent box. He said she would need flat stone, an iron pipe if she could find one, and enough sense to listen when he told her something was dangerous. Then he walked back down the track toward town, the cane tapping a rhythm on the frozen ground that Alma would learn to listen for every morning. He came back at dawn. Alma had already gathered stone, flat sandstone slabs broken from the rubble pile outside the east wall, none wider than a forearm's length, none heavier than she could carry with Nell watching and Walter trying to carry one himself. Rowan inspected each piece by knocking it with his cane. Solid ring meant solid stone. Dull thud meant a crack inside that would split under heat. He rejected 4 out of 9. The vent box took shape in the northeast corner over 3 days. Rowan directed. Alma built. The design was simple in principle and brutal in labor. A waist-high channel of stacked flat stone, mortared with creek clay mixed with sand and wood ash, running from the northeast floor crack to the base of the wall. At the wall, the channel turned upward into a vertical stack. They needed an iron flue pipe for the vertical run, something that could withstand heat and weather and carry the exhaust above the wall top where wind would pull it clear. Alma found the pipe on the second day. She walked 2 miles to a ruined boiler shed near an abandoned prospect south of town, a place where someone had once tried to run a steam pump and failed. The boiler was rust and wreckage, but a section of 8-inch iron flue pipe lay in the weeds, still sound. It weighed more than Nell. Alma dragged it home on a plank sled made from the door she had been sleeping on, which meant the children spent that night on the bare floor while she hauled iron through frozen mud. She arrived back at the barn after dark, with the pipe across her shoulders and her hands so cramped from gripping cold iron that she could not open them for 10 minutes. Walter had cried himself to sleep. Nell had wrapped him in both quilts and sat awake with her back against the warm wall, waiting, 5 years old, and already learning that waiting was a kind of work. Rowan set the pipe the next morning. He insisted the stack rise at least 2 feet above the wall top. Higher means more pull, he said. The wind does the work if you let it. A vent that ends below the roofline is a vent that reverses when the wind changes. When it reverses, the gas comes back down. You smell it if you are awake. You do not smell it if you are asleep. Alma asked what happened when you did not smell it. Rowan said nothing. He fitted the pipe into the stone channel and packed clay around the base with his bare hands, pressing it firm, checking the seal with his thumbnail. The clay would cure slowly in the floor heat. By the time it hardened, it would hold like mortar. When the vent was finished, Rowan tied a fresh wool thread to the pipe mouth, and they watched. The thread pulled outward, steady, constant. The underground fire was drawing through the channel, up the pipe, and out into the November air, carrying with it the sulfur smell and the invisible gas that Alma had almost sealed inside her children's sleeping space. She stood beside the vent and felt the faint, warm breath of it on her face, and for the first time since Thomas died, something she had built was working. But the vent box was not a house. It was a single channel in a single corner, and Winter was not going to wait while she learned the rest. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who could see the work but not the reason behind it? That night, Alma lay on the door plank, retrieved after the pipe haul and repositioned on its flat rock risers, with both children pressed against her and the quilt pulled to their chins. The threads on the willow stakes moved in the dark. She could not see them, but she could hear the faintest whisper of air passing through the northeast crack, the chimney she had tried to seal and that Rowan had opened again. The sound was thin and constant, like a breath drawn through closed teeth. Somewhere beneath the floor, the fire turned in its bed. It had been burning before Alma arrived. It would burn after she was gone. The question was not whether the fire existed. The question was whether she could learn its language before December taught her what she had gotten wrong. The willow threads moved. The children slept. And outside the roofless walls, the first true cold crept down from the divide, patient and absolute, with 5 weeks left to reach the valley floor. Rowan came every morning for the next 11 days. He arrived when the light was gray enough to see the wool threads and left when the cough bent him double, which happened earlier each afternoon. He never mentioned the cough except once when Alma asked if he needed to stop. He said the day he stopped would be the day they buried him under something heavier than conversation, and that she should worry about the floor, not his lungs. The second teaching was separation. The ground heat was a gift, but a gift that could cook them. Rowan had seen it in the mines, men who worked above hot coal and thought the warmth was comfort until the floor cracked and the temperature beneath jumped from warm to blistering in an hour. The living floor had to be separated from the fire floor, the way a pot is separated from a stove by an iron trivet, close enough to receive the heat, far enough to survive it. They built it in layers. First, flat stone sleepers laid in parallel rows across the barn floor, each one 6 inches tall, cut from rubble Alma broke with Thomas's handsaw, used as a wedge, and a river rock used as a hammer. The sleepers created channels, narrow gaps running the length of the barn where air could move beneath the living surface. Above the sleepers, Alma packed a layer of sand mixed with creek clay and tamped it flat with the back of the saw. Above the clay, she laid scavenged brick, broken pieces from a collapsed chimney she found a quarter-mile east, carried back 4 at a time in the flour sack because she had no barrow and no cart. The brick formed the surface the children would sleep on. 2 narrow inspection channels ran along the east and west walls, each one covered by a removable stone cap. Rowan insisted on these. If the heat spikes, he said, you lift the cap and look. If you see orange or smell sharp, you get the children out and you do not come back until the thread test says clean. He made Alma repeat this. She repeated it. He made her repeat it again. She repeated it again. The labor broke her hands. The sandstone sleepers had edges that split skin, and the creek clay dried and cracked on her knuckles, and the brick fragments weighed enough that carrying 4 of them a quarter mile left her arms shaking by the time she reached the barn. Nell learned to sort brick by size, sitting on the warm floor with a pile in front of her, pushing the flat ones left and the broken ones right. Walter carried sand in the coffee tin, 1 trip at a time, 20 steps from the pile to the floor, a 3-year-old's contribution that took all morning and filled 1 corner. Rowan watched the children work and said nothing sentimental. He said flat ones left, broken ones right was good sorting, and that Walter needed a bigger tin. 3 weeks until December. The stone walls were scraped clean of loose soot. The vent box drew steady. The raised floor covered 2/3 of the interior. No roof. The glass came because a freight car broke an axle. Jonah Rusk was 26, a railroad repair hand who worked the siding at Langford Junction. He had come from Pennsylvania with a trade, glazing, that the railroad found useful only when windows shattered, which was often enough to keep him employed and seldom enough to bore him. He was lean, quiet in the way that men who work with fragile materials learn to be quiet, and he had hands that moved with a precision Alma noticed before she noticed anything else about him. The freight car had been carrying greenhouse sash and glass panes bound for a Denver estate, a conservatory ordered by someone rich enough to grow roses in January. The derailment cracked crates, shattered half the shipment, and left the railroad agent with a manifest full of damaged goods, and no interest in hauling broken glass to Denver for a claim adjustment that would cost more than the freight. Alma heard about the wreck from Miriam, who heard it from the wash line, where information moved as reliably as it moved at Brackett's stove, but with less tobacco smoke. She walked to the siding with Nell on her hip and asked the agent what he wanted for the broken crates. The agent looked at her the way men looked at women who asked questions about freight, with the particular discomfort of a man who has an answer but does not want to give it to the person asking. He said the glass was waste. He said she could have it if she signed for it and cleared it by Friday, because the siding needed the space and his supervisor needed the paperwork. Alma signed for waste glass. She washed blood from the packing canvas where a handler had cut himself on a broken pane. She sorted through the crates with Nell sitting on a rail tie, pulling out every pane that had not cracked through the center, every sash frame that still held its corners, every strip of lead and tin that could be bent back into shape. The unbroken panes were thick greenhouse glass, heavier than window glass, with a faint green tint that caught the light like creek water. Jonah Rusk helped her carry the first load back to the barn. He did not volunteer. Alma asked. She asked the way she had asked Rowan for teaching and Brackett for nails, without apology, without softness, with the plain transaction of a person who needed something and could see the person who had it. Jonah carried glass because Alma asked, and because he was curious about what a woman planned to do with 43 greenhouse panes in a roofless ruin above a coal seam. He saw the vent box and the raised floor and the wool threads moving in the draft, and he stood for a long time without speaking. Then he said he knew how to set glass in putty and tin strips so that snow melt ran outward instead of pooling. He said overlapping panes like shingles was stronger than butting them edge to edge. He said he would come back Saturday if she had the frames ready. Rowan approved of the glazier, but not the glass. Too many panes means too many cracks, he said. Every crack is a path for water. Water on hot stone is steam. Steam in an enclosed space is pressure you cannot see. Overlap them tight and putty them tighter, or the first freeze will pop them like corn in a skillet. The third teaching was roofing. Not carpentry. Alma had no lumber for a proper roof frame. She had charred rafter stumps in the wall tops and whatever timber she could beg, barter, or drag from the wreck of other people's failures. Rowan showed her how to use the existing wall-top sockets, bracing new poles between them at a pitch steep enough to shed snow. The poles were not milled. They were peeled aspen trunks, still green, cut from a stand near the creek. They would warp as they dried. But warp took months, and Alma needed weeks. Jonah came Saturday and the Saturday after. He taught Alma and Rowan how to bed each pane in a channel of putty mixed with linseed oil, which Alma did not have, so she used rendered tallow from a bone Miriam's dog had buried, which smelled worse but sealed nearly as well. Tin strips held the pane edges in place, bent over with a flat rock, each one tapped until the glass sat firm against the strip beneath it. The panes overlapped by a thumb's width, like fish scales. Snow melt would run down the overlap and off the edge of the roof onto the outside ground, not into the living space. 29 panes set by the end of the second week in December, 14 still to go. The south slope was nearly covered. The north slope had poles and canvas and hope. 2 weeks until the deep cold. South roof frame up, 29 panes seated. And then Nell burned with fever. The child woke crying in the dark, and her forehead was a coal pressed against Alma's wrist. Not the mild warmth of a cold coming on. A heat that came from inside, fast and steep. The kind that made a mother's hand flinch before her mind could name the fear. Alma stripped the quilts and pressed a wet rag to Nell's neck and watched her daughter's breathing go shallow and rapid in the lamplight. There was no doctor in Langford. The nearest physician rode a circuit from Boulder and would not come for a woman with no credit and no husband. Alma boiled willow bark in the tin kettle, a remedy her mother had used in St. Louis, and her mother's mother before that, and cooled it, and tipped it past Nell's lips while the child shivered against the warm brick floor. Walter sat in the corner with his knees drawn up, watching his sister with the stillness of a child who understands that something is wrong, but does not understand what wrong means when it is this close. Rowan did not come that day. He had been absent 2 days running, which was unusual. Alma did not yet know that his coughing had turned to blood that morning, or that he was sitting in his rented room with a rag pressed to his mouth, waiting for the fit to pass. She knew only that she was alone with a feverish child and an unfinished roof, and 10 days left before December turned to January and the real winter settled in. She set pains alone, one at a time, kneeling on the aspen poles above the raised floor, pressing putty with fingers that had cracked along every knuckle, fitting tin strips with a flat stone while Nell slept below and Walter counted the taps. She cracked one pane pressing too hard. She cracked another when her knee slipped on a pole and she caught herself with the hand holding the glass. 6 panes lost to mistakes, and 1 to a gust of wind that caught the edge before the putty set. 7 days before Christmas. Rowan returned thinner. He did not explain. He sat on the wall top and directed Alma through the last 4 panes on the south slope with a voice that came in fragments between coughs. He told her the canvas over the north slope would hold through moderate wind, but not through a gale, and that she needed to weight the edges with stone, or the first real blow would tear it loose and take the pole frame with it. Miriam Coe came back on the 5th day before Christmas. She carried 2 oilcloth sheets under her arm and said only, "Don't make me regret this." The oilcloth went over the canvas on the north slope. Miriam helped Alma weight the edges. They worked in silence because silence was the only language left between a woman who had withdrawn and a woman who could not afford to notice. Abel Quince reappeared the same week. He stood outside the barn and looked at the glass roof glinting in the thin December sun, and the stone vent stack rising above the wall line, and the wool thread at the pipe mouth pulling steady in the cold air. He walked inside. He felt the floor with his hand. He looked at the inspection channels with their removable caps and the raised brick surface, and the children's bedding folded on the warm stones. He said, "Clever work does not make a mother fit." He said it without conviction, the way a man repeats a verdict he is no longer certain of, but is not yet willing to retract. Then he left. Matthias had not been idle. He pressured the railroad agent to refuse Alma further salvage from the derailment. The agent complied because Matthias had investors who shipped ore on the same line, and a freight agent who refused a shipper's request was a freight agent who rode the next layoff list. Honora spread a second rumor, that Alma was not using waste glass but stolen coal, that the warm barn was heated by fuel taken from the company stores at night. The rumor had no evidence, but rumors in a small town do not need evidence. They need repetition. The store still refused credit. The school still seated Nell near the door. And the calendar said December with the confidence of a creditor who knows exactly when the payment is due. By the 15th of December, 2/3 of the barn wore a sloped glass roof that caught the light and held it. The remaining third wore oilcloth over canvas, over aspen poles, weighted with stone. The south wall gleamed. The north wall looked like a bandaged wound. It was not beautiful. It was not finished. But Rowan said the word that mattered. Test it. Alma borrowed 3 thermometers from Jonah Rusk's railroad repair shed, mercury tubes in tin cases, the kind used to check boiler temperatures. She hung one near the floor, one at child height on a string tied to a wall pin, and one near the peak of the glass roof where the warmest air would collect. Outside dawn temperature on the 16th of December, 12 degrees above zero. Inside the barn before sunrise, 64 near the floor, 58 at child height, 40 near the glass peak where the cold night had stolen the most heat. Alma lowered a candy thermometer on a string through the east inspection channel. The reading at the fire floor, 6 inches below the brick surface, was 85 degrees. 64 degrees inside a roofless ruin in December, without a stove, without coal, without firewood. The numbers were a language Matthias could not speak and Abel could not dismiss. But the early success came with flaws that Alma cataloged the way Rowan had taught her to catalog, by evidence, not by feeling. Condensation formed on the inside of the glass panes and dripped onto the bedding. The roof sweated as warm air met cold glass, and the drip fell heaviest along the seams where putty was thinnest. Walter threw a button at a pane and cracked it because Walter was 3 and buttons were the only projectiles available. Warmth rose unevenly from the floor, leaving a cold pocket near the doorway where the south face still had no door, only a heavy canvas flap weighted with stones. Miriam came, felt the air inside, and said the place was like a wash house in July. But she would not let Eula stay overnight, not until she was sure the gas stayed in the pipe, and the heat stayed in the floor, and the roof stayed on the poles. Abel said warmth was not proof. He did not say what proof would look like. Matthias said she was cooking the children over a mine fire, and that when the county inspector came, the children would leave in a wagon, and Alma would leave in whatever she had arrived in. Rowan said little. He tapped the vent stack with his cane and watched the wool thread. The thread pulled steady. But once, during a hard gust from the northwest, the thread at the northeast vent fluttered, reversed, and pulled inward for 3 seconds before correcting. Rowan said nothing about it to Alma, but his face changed the way a man's face changes when he sees a crack in a wall he has just told someone is sound. The blizzard did not arrive all at once. It announced itself the way all deep cold announces itself on the high plains, through the behavior of animals and instruments and sky. Cattle crowded fences on the ranches south of town, pressing together with their backs to the north, refusing to graze. The barometer at Brackett's store dropped faster than the mercury at the bottom of a mine shaft. The telegraph line west of Langford went dead on the 23rd of January because the wire contracted in the cold until a splice gave way, and no one would ride out to fix it with the wind coming the way the wind was coming. The sky went flat and white, the color of lard, and the air tasted of iron, and the snow began not as flakes, but as a fine granular hiss that scoured exposed skin like sand. The cattle were right. The barometer was right. The wire was right. Late January 1887, the winter that had been killing cattle since November came down from the divide with the patience of something that had been waiting for the town to believe the worst was over. At the Hale house, Honora ordered both the parlor stove and the kitchen stove run at full draw. The hired man fed split pine until the stove seams glowed a dull cherry red. Honora kept the doors shut and the curtains drawn, and the children, Alma's children, out of her mind because Alma's children were not her problem and never had been. The parlor stove held. The kitchen stove did not. It was a Langford pattern cast iron firebox, heavy and reliable under normal use, but a stove that has been run at full draw for 18 hours develops stresses along the seams that cast iron was never meant to carry. When the hired man threw a pan of icy water against the side to cool a handle, the thermal shock cracked the firebox along a seam that ran from the fuel door to the flue collar. The crack was not wide. It did not need to be wide. Smoke poured through it into the kitchen, and the draft collapsed, and the kitchen filled with the greasy black haze of incomplete combustion. Matthias had his second stove and his coal pile, and his hired men, and his milk cow. But a cracked firebox cannot be welded in a blizzard, and a house with one working stove and 2 floors and 4 exterior walls loses heat through every surface that is not fed, while a stone barn with a coal fire beneath its floor and glass above its head does not need to be fed at all. He did not know that yet. He would learn. Inside the barn, Alma woke to Nell's cough. The fever had returned, or it had never fully left. It had only dropped low enough to pass for health while the child was warm and still. Now Nell's breathing came in short, wet pulls that sounded like cloth tearing slowly. Walter slept beside her, undisturbed, 3 years old and armored by the deep unconsciousness of children who have not yet learned that the sounds their sisters make in the night can mean something permanent. The thermometer at child height read 69 degrees. Outside, the wind drove snow against the glass roof in waves that sounded like gravel thrown by the handful. The oilcloth on the north slope snapped and strained against its weights. The wool thread at the northeast vent pulled outward. Steady. For now. Alma heated water in the kettle on the warm floor, no fire needed, just time and the patient heat of the earth, and pressed a damp rag to Nell's chest. She boiled more willow bark. She counted the child's breaths because counting was something she could do, and doing was the only defense she had against the panic that crouched in the back of her skull like an animal waiting for her to sit still. Rowan did not come. The snow made the track impassable for a man with a cane, and the cold made it dangerous for a man with blood in his lungs. Alma was alone with 2 children and a glass roof and a coal seam fire, and the worst storm in a generation. At the second hour after midnight, Miriam Coe hammered on the canvas door flap. She held Eula against her chest with both arms, and Eula's hands were white, not pale, white, the color of tallow, the color of wax, the color of skin that has stopped receiving blood because the body has decided that the extremities are expendable and the core is not. Alma pulled them inside. The warm air hit Miriam's face and she made a sound, not a word, something older than words, a sound from the back of the throat that meant safety recognized after terror. Eula's fingers began to flush pink within minutes, which meant the frostbite had not gone deep, which meant Miriam had carried her daughter through the storm fast enough. The barn was no longer a private refuge. It was a test under crowding. 5 people in a space designed for 3. 2 children sick or close to it. 1 woman whose faith in the barn had been conditional now inside it because every other option had failed. At the 3rd hour, the wool thread at the northeast vent reversed. Alma saw it from across the barn. The thread had been pulling outward since Rowan set the pipe, a constant exhalation of warm gas rising through the stone channel and up the iron flue and out into the wind. Now it hung limp. Then it pulled inward, toward the living space, toward the children. The wind had shifted. Snow had drifted against the outside base of the vent stack, blocking the outlet. The fire beneath the floor did not stop burning because the vent was blocked. The fire did not care about the vent. The fire cared about air. And when the exit closed, the gas that had been leaving began to pool. Alma smelled it within a minute. The sulfur edge that had always lived in the background, the faint mine-rot smell that she had learned to ignore, sharpened. It went from background to present the way a sound goes from distant to close. If you're invested in this story, hit subscribe and stay with us, because the next few minutes decide whether Alma built a refuge or a trap. She had to choose. Nell lay on the warm floor with a wet rag on her chest and a fever that had not broken. Eula lay beside her, fingers still pink and fragile. Walter slept between them. Miriam crouched against the south wall, watching Alma's face for information she did not want to ask for. Alma pulled on Thomas's coat, which was too large for her and smelled of a man who was not coming back. She pushed through the canvas door flap and went into the storm. The wind hit her like a wall, not a gust. A sustained horizontal force that drove ice crystals into her eyes and her nose and the gap between her collar and her neck. The snow was knee-deep against the south wall and deeper at the corners where it had drifted. She could not see the vent stack. She could not see the wall top. She could see approximately 4 feet in front of her face, and what she saw was white moving at the speed of malice. She crawled along the east wall with her left hand on the stone and her right hand forward, feeling for the northeast corner. The stone was warm even through her glove, the coal fire beneath sending its heat upward through 2 feet of sandstone, a reminder that the same force keeping her children alive was the force trying to poison them. She counted courses of stone as she moved. 8 courses to the corner. At the corner, the wind tried to tear her from the wall. She hooked her arm around the corner stone and pulled herself to the north side. The vent stack was buried. Snow had packed against the base in a solid drift that reached the pipe mouth and sealed it as effectively as the clay patch she had pressed into the floor crack weeks ago, the one Rowan had knocked loose with his cane and his warning. The drift was hard, wind-packed, not loose powder she could sweep away, but compressed ice crystals that needed to be broken. She dug with her hands. She had no shovel. She had no tool that the wind would not tear from her grip. She dug with gloved fingers and then with bare fingers when the gloves soaked through and froze stiff. The ice cut her skin. The wind drove snow into the gap she cleared as fast as she cleared it. She broke the crust with her fists and scooped the loose material away and broke again and scooped again, and the stack appeared inch by inch, the iron pipe, the clay seal at the base, the stone channel mouth. She cleared the pipe mouth. The warm gas hit her face in a rush that smelled of sulfur and tasted of metal. She turned her head and breathed clean air from the wind, then reached down and opened the low intake vent at the base of the channel, a stone slab Rowan had insisted on, a secondary air path that fed cold air into the bottom of the channel and pushed the gas upward. The thread. She could not see the thread from outside. She could not know if the draft had reversed. She crawled back along the wall, around the corner, and through the canvas flap, and she looked at the northeast vent, and the wool thread was pulling outward, outward, steady. The fire was breathing again. The gas smell faded within minutes. The air inside the barn cleared. Nell coughed but breathed. Eula's fingers stayed pink. Walter had not woken. At the 6th hour, the glass roof groaned under the snow load. The weight pressed the panes against the tin strips and the tin strips against the aspen poles. And the sound was a low, continuous creak that lived at the edge of hearing, the way a bridge sounds when the load approaches the limit. Alma could not clear the roof from inside. The slope was too steep and the panes too fragile. Jonah Rusk appeared out of the storm with a broom handle. He had walked from the railroad shed because the shed stove had gone out, and he remembered where warmth lived. He climbed the outside of the east wall, braced himself against the wind, and swept the lower panes clear with long strokes that sent sheets of snow sliding off the glass and into the drift below. The groaning stopped. One glass strip cracked under the broom, a pane weakened by the cold and the weight, and Alma patched it from inside with oilcloth and a breadboard pressed flat against the gap. At the 8th hour, Abel Quince arrived. He came not with authority, but with a half-frozen hired boy from a ranch shed 2 miles south. The boy's lips were blue and his words were gone, and Abel carried him through the canvas flap and set him on the warm brick floor near the east inspection channel where the heat rose strongest. Abel said nothing at first because his mustache was frozen to his scarf, and speaking required tearing them apart. When he could speak, he said the town hall was colder than the ruin. He said this without irony, without admission, without the vocabulary for what it meant that the building the town had built with money and men and proper materials was failing, while the building a widow had built with salvage and a crippled Welshman's knowledge was holding. The boy's color returned within the hour. Abel sat against the south wall and watched the thermometer at child height. It read 71. At the 10th hour, Matthias and Honora Hale pushed through the canvas flap. They did not come with apology. They came with desperation. Honora's fingers were wrapped in linen napkins that had already soaked through with the clear fluid that comes from frostbitten skin when it begins to warm and die at the same time. Matthias's face was the color of old ash, gray and tight, the face of a man who has spent 10 hours in a house with a cracked stove and a broken chimney, and the growing understanding that wealth is not warmth. Their water is stone, Matthias said. The stove is broken. He did not say please. He did not say he was wrong. He said the facts because facts were the only currency he had left, and even those were counterfeit now. Alma looked at him. She looked at Honora's wrapped hands. She looked at the door frame, the canvas flap that served as the only barrier between the warm interior and the killing cold. And she thought about a christening dress and a question about which child she would leave first. She opened the door, but she made Matthias carry in Miriam's wood box first, a crate of split kindling that Miriam had brought 2 days ago, stacked outside the south wall. It needed to come in, and the man who had ridden a horse to this barn 6 weeks ago to call it a grave could carry a box of firewood through the snow to earn his place in it. Matthias carried the box. His hands shook. Not from cold alone. Shelter is not submission. Alma gave them the corner farthest from the vent, nearest the warm south wall, and she did not give them her quilts. Honora sat down on the brick floor and felt the warmth through her skirts and began to cry. Silently, the way a woman cries when she recognizes something she has spent months denying. By dawn, the storm had not stopped, but it had thinned enough to see the glass roof from inside, and what Alma saw was frost feathering the outside of the panes in crystalline patterns while condensation dripped down the inside surfaces in warm trails. The glass was a border between two worlds. Outside, white, still, 22 degrees below zero according to Jonah's thermometer hung on a nail outside the door. Inside, wet, close, warm, alive. The bean vines Alma had started in a shallow box near the south wall, an experiment, a hope planted in soil warmed by the earth beneath, hung green and damp. Not thriving, surviving, which was enough. The thermometer at child height read 78 degrees. Alma lifted the yeast inspection cap and lowered the candy thermometer. 89 at the fire floor. She checked the west channel. 84. She walked to the northeast vent and watched the wool thread pull outward in its steady, patient rhythm. She opened the low intake. Cold air whispered through. The system Rowan had built and she had repaired was drawing clean. Matthias sat against the south wall with Walter asleep across his legs. The boy had crawled there sometime in the night because warmth draws children the way water draws roots, without intention, without decision, just the body moving toward what it needs. Matthias looked down at his grandson sleeping under a single sheet instead of 3 quilts. He looked at the glass roof and the vent stack and the threads, and the brick floor and the bean vines and the thermometer that read a number he could not have predicted, and he had no language for it yet. He had no language for defeat. Not yet. That would come later, in a county office, in front of witnesses, when the paper he had filed and the claim he had pressed and the story he had told about a grave and a christening dress met the evidence of a barn that had held 78 degrees while his cast iron stove cracked and his chimney iced and his water turned to stone. But that was later. For now, he sat in the warmth of a place he had called trash, and his grandson slept on his legs, and the thread at the vent pulled outward, and the storm pressed against the glass without entering. Outside, the hidden earth burned in its own time. Inside, a woman who had been given $2 and a road sat beside her feverish daughter and watched the willow bark tea cool and knew, not believed, not hoped, but knew that she had built something the winter could not take. The ruin held. The children breathed. The storm was not finished, but the question had changed. It was no longer whether Alma could survive. It was what would happen when the people who had tried to break her had to live with the fact that she had not broken. The storm broke on the third day. The wind died first, then the snow thinned to a dry sift, then the sky cracked along the eastern ridge, and pale yellow light poured across the valley like water finding a ditch. The temperature stayed below zero for 2 more days, but the killing pressure was gone. People moved. Smoke rose from chimneys that had survived. The road between Langford and the rail junction opened enough for a man on foot. Matthias and Honora left at first light the morning the wind stopped. Matthias carried his wife across the threshold of the canvas flap and did not look back. Honora looked back once. She looked at the glass roof and the green bean vines and the children sleeping on warm brick, and then she turned her face into her husband's shoulder and let him walk her down the track. They did not say thank you. Alma did not need them to. Abel Quince returned 4 days after the storm with a notebook. Not the kind of notebook a man carries for show. This was a surveyor's field book, leather-bound, small enough for a coat pocket, the pages ruled in pencil columns. Abel had carried this notebook into cabins where children had frozen beside dead stoves. He had carried it into line shacks where drovers had burned furniture and then boot leather and then died anyway. He inventoried failure for the county because someone had to, and because the numbers, terrible as they were, kept the next round of failures from being worse. He walked the warm house the way he had walked those doomed cabins, slowly, methodically, writing in the columns. But this time the numbers were different. He checked the bedding. Dry. He pressed his hand to the brick floor. Warm, not hot. He looked at the water crock near the south wall. 12 gallons, still liquid, no film of ice, no frost on the rim. He examined the vent stack from inside, watched the wool thread pull outward. He lifted an inspection cap and held a match over the channel. The flame pulled toward the vent, steady, no flicker, clean draw, no pooling gas. He checked the children. Nell's fever had broken 2 days ago. Her breathing was clear enough that she had argued with Walter that morning about who owned a particular button, which was the surest sign of health Alma had ever witnessed. Walter had a bruise on his shin from climbing the wall to look at the vent pipe. Both children were clothed, fed, warm, and alive. Abel closed the notebook. He stood in the center of the barn, the place where the floor heat was strongest and the air was the cleanest, and the glass roof above let in a column of January light that fell on the brick like a bright cloth laid across a table. Miriam was there. Jonah was there. 2 women from the wash line who had come because Miriam had told them what the inside of the barn felt like, and they had not believed her. And now they stood with their hands at their sides and their mouths slightly open because the air inside the barn was warmer than the air inside their own houses. Abel said, "I was wrong about the barn." He let the words sit. Then he said, "I was wrong about her." He said this directly to Miriam and Jonah, which meant he intended it to be repeated, which meant he was not apologizing in private, but correcting the record in the only public forum available. A poor overseer who admits error in front of witnesses has made a decision about his own authority that cannot be taken back. Abel understood this. He said it anyway. Alma was holding the candy thermometer on a string. She had been checking the inspection channel when Abel spoke. She did not respond to the admission. She wound the string around the thermometer and set it on the wall ledge and said the floor was reading 82 today, down from 89 during the storm, which meant the coal seam's heat output varied with surface conditions and she needed to track it. Abel wrote the number in his notebook. He wrote it because it was a number, and numbers were the only language he had never distrusted. The women came first. This was not a coincidence and not a social nicety. It was economics. In Langford, women managed warmth the way they managed every other resource that sat between their families, and death, by hand, by habit, by the daily arithmetic of what was enough and what was not. They banked stoves and rationed coal and calculated how many hours a scuttle would last and which room to heat and which room to surrender. They hung blankets across doorways to trap warmth in smaller spaces. They knew the cost of cold the way they knew the cost of flour, by the week, by the pound, by the child. Miriam asked first. She wanted to know how to build a stone hotbed against a south-facing wall, not over a coal seam because she did not have a coal seam, but using the same principle of stone mass and glass cover and retained heat. Alma walked her through it, flat stone against the wall, packed with clay, a shallow bed of soil on top, glass laid over the bed at an angle facing south, so the winter sun entered and the stone absorbed, and the glass held the warmth overnight. Miriam could start onion sets and lettuce in February. Not a luxury, a defense against the scurvy math that killed as many frontier children as cold did. The school teacher came next. She asked whether seedlings could start in Alma's barn before thaw and be transplanted after the last frost. She asked this carefully, because asking Alma for help required admitting that Alma's barn was worth something, and admitting that required abandoning the gossip she had repeated for months. Alma said yes. She said the south wall bed got the most light and the most stable heat. She said the teacher could have 2 feet of bed space if she supplied her own soil. A miner's wife named Dagna, a quiet Norwegian woman who had not spoken to Alma since the eviction, asked about venting a warm spot near her husband's shaft shed. The ground near the shaft radiated enough heat to melt snow in a circle, and Dagna wanted to know if she could use it safely. Alma asked 3 questions. How wide was the warm circle? Did the air near it smell? And was there a draft? Dagna answered. Alma said the warm spot was probably a shallow heat leak from the shaft, not a seam fire, and that Dagna could build a cold frame over it if she vented one end and never enclosed it fully. She repeated Rowan's warning because it was Rowan's warning and not hers to soften. Heat underfoot is not a gift unless air has a road out. The women wrote nothing down. They did not need to. They carried the information the way they carried everything else, in their hands, and in the habits they would build from it. The measurable results traveled faster than the advice. People compared because comparison was the only metric available. An ordinary cabin in Langford burned 1 scuttle of coal by midnight and still froze wash water near the door by dawn. Alma's warm house kept a 12-gallon crock liquid through the night without a stove fire. An ordinary cabin required 6 cords of wood to survive a winter, and a family that fell short of 6 cords knew exactly how many February nights stood between them and empty. Alma had burned nothing. Her heat came from below. Her only fuel cost was vigilance, checking vents, clearing snow from the stack, monitoring the inspection channels, watching the wool threads. The glass roof lost 6 panes during the January storm. Alma replaced 4 with salvage Jonah brought from the railroad shed. The other 2 she patched with oilcloth that she intended to replace and never did, because oilcloth that holds is oilcloth that stays. The stone walls held heat long enough that, even during the replacement, when the roof was open to the sky for the time it took to seat a new pane, the interior temperature dropped only 11 degrees before recovering. By the last week of January, Shallow wooden boxes lined the south wall base, filled with soil warmed from beneath. Lettuce seeds went in. Bean seeds went in. Alma planted them not because she expected a harvest, but because she expected a question. If the floor can warm a child, can it warm a root? The answer came in 2 weeks. Green shoots pushed through dark soil while snow pressed against the outside of the glass. The sight of it, green against white, life against the dead season, did something to the people who saw it that no thermometer reading could do. The numbers proved the method. The lettuce proved the meaning. Matthias Hale tried to rewrite the story before the story was finished. He came to the barn 3 days after the storm, not on horseback this time, but on foot, which meant he had made a decision about how he wanted to appear. He wore his good coat and carried his hat, and spoke in the voice he used for business. Level, reasonable, the voice of a man offering a deal that only a fool would refuse. He said the barn was dangerous. He said Alma had endangered his grandchildren by housing them over an active coal fire. He said that the storm had forced him inside against his judgment, and that what he had witnessed confirmed his concern. The vent had reversed, the gas had entered the living space, and only luck had prevented a disaster. He said these things in front of no one, because he had waited until Miriam and Jonah were gone and the children were at the far wall sorting brick. Then he offered to buy the property. $20, a fortune measured against the $2 Alma had paid. An insult measured against what the barn had become. Alma said no. Matthias adjusted. He said 25. He said he would settle Thomas's company store debt, which still sat on the ledger like a stone on a grave. He said he would give Alma a room, a real room, in the house, not the wash house, and that the children would have a proper roof. Alma said no. Matthias's voice changed. The business register dropped away, and something harder came through, the way bedrock comes through when topsoil washes off. He said a woman who refused charity and refused sale was a woman who wanted to be broken, and that the county would break what the cold had not. Alma said the county had already come. She said Abel Quince had walked the barn with a notebook and written numbers that matched no doomed cabin he had ever visited. She said this not with triumph, but with the flatness of a woman stating coordinates. Matthias left. He walked down the track with his good coat buttoned and his hat in his hand, and Alma watched him go and felt nothing that she could name and everything that she could not. Rowan Price came back on the last day of January. He walked slowly. The cane bore more weight than before, and the cough had settled into something continuous. Not the periodic fits of December, but a low, constant rattle that lived in his chest, the way the coal fire lived in the earth, always burning, never quite visible. He stood inside the barn and looked at the vent stack and the wool thread and the brick floor and the glass roof. He looked at the patched pane and the oilcloth repairs and the shallow boxes of green shoots along the south wall. He walked to the northeast corner and tapped the vent box with his cane and listened to the sound the stone made. He bent, slowly, painfully, one hand on his knee, and held a match near the thread. The flame pulled toward the vent. Clean draw. He looked at the low intake vent, the stone slab Alma had opened during the storm. It sat at the correct angle. He looked at the inspection channels with their removable caps. He looked at the floor between them, where Alma had reset 2 brick sections that had shifted during the cold snap. "You listen to the stone," he said. This was their bond, not sentiment, not the softness of a man who felt sorry for a woman, technical respect, the recognition that she had taken what he taught and applied it under pressure, alone, in the dark, with the wind trying to kill her children and the gas trying to finish what the wind started. He did not praise broadly. He tapped the vent and the floor and the inspection cap the way a teacher checks a student's work, not by asking if they understood, but by looking at what they built. In the days that followed, Rowan came when his lungs allowed. He taught Alma how to read the inspection channels for changes in the coal seam's behavior. A rise in temperature meant the fire had found new fuel or new air. A drop meant it was banking. A shift in the draw pattern meant the underground geology had changed. He told her about the Ronda, about the mines where he had learned to read fire through stone, about a shaft collapse in 1873 that had buried two men in a passage where the air turned before anyone smelled it. He told her this not as confession, but as curriculum. The dead men were data. The collapsed shaft was a lesson. Rowan's grief was expressed not in tears, but in the precision of his teaching. He wanted Alma to know what he knew, because what he knew could keep her alive, and because keeping her alive was the only use his knowledge had left. They built the thermal bench together in the first week of February. It ran along the south wall, waist high, made from stacked stone and packed gravel, and a top layer of flat brick salvaged from the same collapsed chimney that had supplied the floor. The bench sat directly above the warmest section of the raised floor, and the stone mass absorbed heat from below during the day and radiated it back at night. Rowan designed it. Alma hauled the stone. They mortared it together in silence, except for Rowan's instructions, which came in the short, clipped phrases of a man conserving breath. Set the base wider than the top. Gravity keeps it. Mortar does not. The bench became the center of the barn's daily life. Alma dried herbs on it. Nell sat on it to read the primer Miriam had lent her. Walter slept on it during afternoon naps, curled like a cat on warm stone. And when Rowan came in the mornings, he sat on the bench and coughed and drank the willow bark tea Alma made him and held the warm cup between his scarred hands and said nothing about the fact that the tea was medicine and the medicine was kindness, and the kindness was the only payment Alma had ever offered that he could not refuse. He told her about his wife. She had died in the Ronda before Rowan came to Colorado, fever, the kind that took women in the mining villages because the water ran through coal waste and no one connected the black stream to the white sheets they wrapped the bodies in. He told Alma this on the bench, looking at the south wall, on a day when the light through the glass was bright enough to make the soot stains on the stone look like brushstrokes. He said his wife had kept a garden behind their house in Treherbert, and that the garden grew nothing well because the coal dust settled on the leaves, and the rain washed it into the soil, and the soil turned sour. He said the only thing that grew was leeks, because leeks do not care about sour. He said this the way a man says something he has carried for 20 years and is setting down not because the weight has changed, but because he has finally found a surface strong enough to hold it. Alma said nothing. She refilled his cup. The bench was warm. The leaks were gone. But the garden had found its way into the glass house, where the air was clean and the soil was warm, and the coal for once was giving instead of taking. They disagreed about the north slope. Alma wanted to replace the oilcloth with glass. Rowan said the north slope should stay opaque, canvas and oilcloth, because the north face lost more heat than it gained from light, and glass on the north side would cost warmth in exchange for brightness that the plants did not need. Alma argued that light improved the children's mood. Rowan said mood was not a measurement. Alma said mood was the only measurement that mattered when a 5-year-old had spent 2 months in a stone box. Rowan conceded the argument. He conceded it by saying nothing and letting Alma proceed, which was how he conceded everything, by withdrawing his objection rather than admitting he was wrong. 2 days later, he brought a pane he had found in a trash heap behind the railroad shed and set it himself on the north slope in the brightest position. He coughed blood that afternoon. He wiped it on his sleeve and kept working. Alma saw the stain. Rowan saw that she saw it. Neither spoke. Rowan died on the 14th of February, not during a crisis, not in the barn. In his rented room in town, sitting in a chair he had pulled near the window because the window faced south, and the south light reminded him of the glass roof and the green shoots and the warm stone and the woman who had listened. Alma learned of it from Jonah, who learned of it from the landlord, who found Rowan in the chair with his cane across his lap and his coat buttoned and his field notebook open to a page of sketches, brattice walls, vent stacks, warnings about bad air, and a single measurement. The distance from the northeast floor cracked to the pipe mouth, marked in inches, correct to the quarter. Alma did not go to the room. She went to the barn. She checked the vent. She checked the threads. She lifted both inspection caps and lowered the candy thermometer and read the numbers and wrote them in the margin of a feed sack with a pencil stub because she did not have a notebook of her own. Then she sat on the warm floor with her back against the south wall and held her hands in front of her and looked at the scars where the sandstone had cut her and the lime had cracked her and the ice had split her open. And she thought about a man who knocked clay from a vent with his cane and said the word pressure like it meant something the wind would understand. Nell climbed into her lap. Walter leaned against her arm. The bean vines climbed their strings. The south light came through the glass and lay across the floor in a long rectangle that moved with the afternoon, and for a few minutes nothing in the barn had a number attached to it. Jonah brought Rowan's notebook the next day. It was small, leather-bound, the pages dark with pencil, and darkened further with mine dust that had worked into the paper fibers over decades. Sketches of brattice walls, cross-sections of vent channels, a list of temperatures measured in a shaft fire in 1875, warnings written in a hand so cramped it looked like code. Check draw before sleep. Never seal both ends. Air is the master. You are the servant. Alma kept the notebook in the coffee tin, beside the quit-claim deed, beside the dried beans she no longer needed because the warm house was starting to feed her. She no longer needed Rowan to interpret it. She had become the interpreter. The secondary crisis came in March, because March in Colorado is not spring. March is winter pretending to leave, and then returning with a different weapon. A warm spell, 3 days of temperatures above freezing, bright sun, snow melt running off the mesa in streams that turned the road to mud, shifted something underground. The thaw penetrated the soil above the coal seam and found a weakness, a fracture line running beneath the old north manger, where horses had once stood and where Alma had stacked the supply boxes and the children sometimes played. The first sign was vapor, a thin white line rising from a crack in the brick floor that had not been there the day before. Alma saw it at dawn, when the cool morning air made the warm vapor visible. It curled upward like a thread of smoke from a match just blown out. She checked the wool markers nearest the crack. One pulled toward the new opening. The draft had changed. The underground fire had found a new path, or the thaw had opened one, and the warm gas was rising through a channel that had no vent box, no iron pipe, no controlled exhaust. It was rising into the space where her children slept. Matthias heard about the crack within the day. How he heard, Alma did not know. Perhaps the school teacher, perhaps one of the wash line women, perhaps the constant invisible current of gossip that connected every doorway in Langford to every other. He went to Abel Quince and told him the barn was collapsing. He said the coal fire was eating the foundation. He said the county was liable if children died in a structure the poor overseer had inspected and approved. Abel came to the barn at noon. He stood outside and looked at the vapor rising from the north end of the roof. He said Alma had 1 week to prove the structure was safe, or he would have to recommend removal of the children. 1 week. The same clock that had started in November was running again, wound by the same man who had wound it the first time. Alma did not argue with Abel. She did not argue with Matthias, who stood behind Abel on the track with his arms folded and his face arranged in the particular expression of a man who believes he is about to win. She went inside the barn and closed the canvas flap and stood over the new crack and thought about everything Rowan had taught her. She ordered the children out. Walter cried because the outside air was cold and his sister was warm, and leaving the warm for the cold was an injustice his 3-year-old sense of fairness could not absorb. Nell took his hand and walked him to Miriam's doorstep without being asked, because Nell was 5 and had learned that when her mother's face looked like that, the correct response was to move. Alma opened every roof vent, the 4 hinge sash frames Jonah had helped her install on the south slope. She opened the canvas flap wide. She opened the low intake at the northeast vent. She flooded the barn with cold air, pushing the warm gas upward and outward, clearing the interior. Then she knelt beside the new crack and did what Rowan had taught her. She tied a wool thread to a willow stake and planted it in the crack. The thread pulled upward and slightly north, toward the nearest wall. She planted 3 more threads along the fracture line. They told her the direction of the draft. The underground fire was venting north and east through the new crack, following the same general pattern as the main vent, but through uncontrolled stone. She lifted the floor brick along the north manger line. She cleared the sand and clay layer beneath it. She found the fracture, a jagged opening in the clinker, no wider than 2 fingers, running at an angle toward the northeast wall. The warm air rising from it was wet and sulfurous. She did not seal it. Sealing was what she had done the first time, and Rowan had knocked the seal open and said the word chimney like it was a curse. Instead, she extended the channel. She cut a trench through the raised floor, brick, clay, sand, down to the stone sleepers, running from the new crack to the northeast vent box. She lined the trench with flat stone and packed clay around the edges and connected it to the existing channel. She gave the new crack a road to the existing chimney. She packed fresh clay around the living floor on both sides of the trench, sealing the gap between the new channel and the sleeping surface. She replaced the brick above the channel and tamped it flat. She closed the roof vents and the canvas flap and waited. The wool thread at the new crack pulled north into the trench toward the vent box. The thread at the pipe mouth pulled outward. The new gas was traveling the path she had built for it, joining the main exhaust, leaving through the iron pipe. She checked every thread in the barn, all pulled in the correct direction. She lowered the candy thermometer into the new channel. 79 degrees. Warm, not dangerous. She lowered it into the main inspection channel. 81. Stable. Abel came back 2 days later. He walked the barn again with his notebook. He examined the new channel and the thread test and the temperature readings. He lifted the inspection caps and looked and wrote. He asked Alma what she had done. She told him in Rowan's vocabulary, draft direction, channel extension, controlled exhaust, and Abel wrote it down because writing it down was the only way he could process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about a woman in a barn and a fire. He closed the notebook. He said, "The structure is sound." He said it without qualification, without the word clever, without the conditional language he had used before. He said it, and he left. Matthias, standing on the track, heard Abel say it. His arms unfolded. His expression did not change because changing expression requires admitting that the previous expression was wrong, and Matthias was not built for that admission. But something behind his face shifted. A gear that had been turning in one direction for months found resistance and slowed. He did not leave the track immediately. He stood and watched Alma bring the children back from Miriam's. He watched Nell walk through the canvas flap with Walter's hand in hers. He watched the flap close behind them. He watched the vapor that had been rising from the north end stop rising because the gas now had a path that did not include the living space. Then he turned and walked down the track, and this time his walk was slower, and the set of his shoulders was lower, and Alma did not watch him go because she was inside, resetting the brick floor cap over the new inspection channel, finishing the work that proved she was no longer a survivor. She was the master of the house. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the next hard season comes. The teaching began the same week, not formally, not with announcements. Miriam brought Dagna and two other women to the barn on a Saturday afternoon, and Alma showed them how to build safe cold frames against south-facing stone walls. She used charcoal on a flat rock to draw the cross-section, stone mass at the back, soil bed in the middle, glass angled over the top, one end open for ventilation. She drew the vent the way Rowan had drawn it for her, with arrows showing airflow direction and a note at the bottom in Rowan's words. Air has a road, or air makes its own. Dagna asked about the warm spot near her husband's shaft shed. Alma repeated the three questions and the same answer she had given weeks ago, and this time Dagna had brought measurements. The warm circle was 4 feet across. The air did not smell, and a candle flame near the ground pulled slightly east. Alma said a cold frame over that spot would grow radishes in March if the vent stayed open. The school teacher brought two boys who wanted to see the vent box. Alma let them look, but not touch. She explained the thread test. She explained the inspection channel. She did not explain it the way a lecturer explains. She explained it the way Rowan had explained it to her, by pointing at something and saying what it did and what would happen if it failed. The boys left with questions their teacher could not answer, which was the best outcome Alma could have hoped for. 3 households began building cold frames that week. Within the month, the number would reach 7. By the end of March, 17 households in and around Langford had copied some part of Alma's method, not the coal seam foundation, which was unique and dangerous and required knowledge most people did not have, but the usable lessons. South-facing glass, stone heat storage, venting, double barriers at doorways, early seed beds. The warm house had stopped being a ruin. It had stopped being a curiosity. It was becoming a school. And Matthias Hale, standing in the county clerk's office on the 2nd of April, filed a challenge to Alma's quitclaim title. He claimed the deed was defective because the land had been classified as unsafe waste at the time of sale, and that a waste classification voided any residential claim. The filing cost him $3, and the services of a lawyer from Boulder who wore a collar so stiff it looked like it could cut paper. The legal clock started. Alma had 30 days to respond. She had survived the cold. She had survived the gas. She had survived the gossip and the isolation and the death of the man who taught her to read fire through stone. Now she had to survive paper. Spring came to Boulder County the way spring always comes to the high country, not as a season, but as a negotiation. Warm days followed by freezing nights, snowmelt in the afternoon, ice by dawn. The ground softened and then hardened and then softened again, and the people who lived on it adjusted the way they had always adjusted, by watching, by waiting, by not trusting anything that had not proven itself twice. Alma did not wait. She improved. The vestibule went up in the first week of April, built from freight crates Jonah brought from the railroad siding. 2 crates, dismantled and reassembled into a narrow entry passage that created a double-door barrier between the warm interior and the outside air. The principle was simple and ancient. Rowan had described it as an airlock, though he used the Welsh word, which sounded like a man clearing his throat. Cold air entered the vestibule when the outer door opened. The inner door stayed shut. The cold air mixed with the warmer vestibule air and lost its edge. Then the inner door opened, and the cold that entered the living space was 15 degrees warmer than the cold outside. The difference between 68 degrees inside and 40 outside was manageable. The difference between 68 and 5 below was not. The vestibule made the difference manageable. She whitewashed the interior stones with a lime wash mixed from quickite she bought with the first money the warm house earned, $3 from the school teacher for 6 weeks of seedling space. The white surface did two things. It increased the light inside the barn by reflecting what came through the glass, turning a single beam into a diffused glow that reached corners the sun could not. And it revealed soot leaks, any crack in the floor seal, any failure in the vent channel, any new path the underground gas found would leave a dark stain on white lime before the nose could detect it. The whitewash was a warning system that cost pennies and worked while Alma slept. She added hinged roof vents, 4 intact sash frames Jonah had salvaged from a demolished freight office. The frames opened on iron hinges, allowing Alma to release excess heat on warm days and seal them on cold nights. The barn's temperature became something she could tune, not just endure. On a bright March afternoon, the interior could climb past 90 degrees without venting, which was excellent for seedlings and unbearable for children. The hinged vents brought it down to 72 within the hour. The cistern barrel came from Miriam, who had replaced her own and had no use for the old one. Alma set it near the east wall, raised on brick risers above the warmest section of the floor, but below the inspection channel so the water warmed gently without cooking. By midwinter, it held water at 58 degrees, cold by summer standards, but liquid, and liquid water in January was a currency more valuable than cash in a town where wells froze and snow had to be melted in kettles over stoves that consumed the coal you needed for heat. The warm house earned, not much, not enough to call it prosperity, but enough to call it survival with a margin. Alma sold seedlings, cabbage, lettuce, onion starts, to women who had watched the January lettuce push through dark soil and decided that if a ruin could grow food, their south-facing walls could too. She sold cut greens when the greens came in, small bundles tied with string, delivered by Nell, who walked to 3 houses a week with a basket and the particular confidence of a child who knows that what she carries matters. She sold designs. Not on paper, Alma still wrote on feed sacks and bark, but in person. She walked to a homestead and looked at the south wall and the ground and the wind pattern, and told the family what they could build and what they should not attempt. She charged nothing for the advice and 50 cents for a day's labor helping them build it. The 50 cents bought nails. The nails held glass. The glass held heat. The chain was short and every link was visible. No, a typical day in the warm house by the autumn of 1887 looked nothing like the desperate November that had created it. Alma woke before dawn because the inspection channels needed checking, and the habit had become as involuntary as breathing. She lifted the east cap, lowered the candy thermometer, read the number, and compared it to the number from the previous morning. She had begun keeping a log in Rowan's notebook, on the blank pages at the back, in a hand that was tighter than Rowan's, but just as precise. The numbers told a story the way a barometer tells weather, not what is happening now, but what is coming. She opened the hinged vents if the morning was warm. She closed them if it was cold. She checked the wool threads at the vent box and the low intake and the 2 secondary channels she had added since the March crack. She watered the seedling boxes along the south wall. She fed Nell and Walter from stores that now included dried beans, cornmeal, a sack of flour she had bought with earned money, and eggs from 2 chickens Miriam had given her in trade for seedling space. By mid-morning, someone usually came. Miriam with laundry to wash in the warm cistern water, Dagna with a question about her cold frame, the school teacher with a student who had asked a question she could not answer about why warm air rises, a miner's wife with a cracked pane that needed replacing. The barn that had been a ruin was now a place people visited, and the woman who had been an outcast was now the person they visited. Jonah came most evenings. He brought putty and glass and news from the railroad. He fixed things Alma pointed to and built things Alma described. He did not move in. He did not presume. He arrived, worked, ate whatever Alma had cooked on the warm floor. No stove, still no stove. The floor did what a stove did, and did it without fuel, and left when the children went to sleep. Their partnership was visible in the quality of the repairs. Alma's stone and clay work beside Jonah's glass and framework, the rough and the precise, the warm and the clear. The second cold snap came in late November of 1887, a full year after Alma's eviction. It arrived without the drama of the January blizzard, no building storm, no days of warning. The temperature simply fell. It fell the way a stone falls from a hand, without negotiation, without transition, from 40 degrees to 4 degrees in a single night. And the night was clear and still, and the stars were so sharp they looked like they could cut. Matthias Hale's remaining stove, the parlor firebox that had survived the January crisis, developed a chimney fire on the second night of the cold snap. Creosote buildup in the flue, the inevitable consequence of burning green wood too fast for too long. The chimney fire did not destroy the house, but it destroyed the draft. The flue sealed with hardened tar. The stove smoked. The house filled with the acrid haze that meant the fire was burning in the wrong direction, and Matthias's hired man, who knew how to feed a stove but not how to clear a chimney, stood in the kitchen with a rag over his face and said he would not sleep in a house that smelled like a kiln. Honora had not fully recovered from the January frostbite. Her right hand had lost 2 fingers, the smallest and the one beside it, to the damage sustained during the walk to Alma's barn. The stumps had healed clean, but the remaining fingers stiffened in cold, and Honora wore gloves inside the house from October forward. She could not work a stove damper. She could not carry a coal scuttle with confidence. The wealth that had once insulated her from consequence now sat in a house with a dead chimney and a husband who had spent 12 months trying to take a barn from the woman whose barn was the only warm building in the district. Matthias had to go to the barn again, and this time witnesses were present. Abel Quince was there. He had taken to visiting weekly, checking the log, copying numbers into his own notebook for the county record. Miriam was there with Eula, washing in the cistern. Jonah was replacing a cracked pane on the south slope. The school teacher had brought 2 students to see the vent system. Matthias stood in the doorway of the vestibule, the double door entry he had never seen because he had not visited since April, and said 3 words. "I came for my wife." Alma looked at him. She looked at the people in the barn, the overseer, the neighbor, the glazier, the teacher, the children, and she looked at Matthias's face, which was the color of old mortar and carried the expression of a man who has run out of sentences. "Then carry water for the room," she said. She pointed to the cistern barrel. The barrel needed filling. The water came from snow melt collected in a trough outside the east wall, and carrying it required lifting a bucket and walking 12 steps and pouring without spilling. It was simple work. It was work that anyone with 2 hands and a back could do. It was work that Matthias Hale, mine investor and cattle buyer, and the man who had offered $2 silver as severance to a woman he expected to crawl back, had never done in his own house because he had hired men for tasks that required lifting. He carried the water. He did it in front of Abel and Miriam and Jonah and the school teacher and the 2 students who would remember it for the rest of their lives. He carried the bucket from the trough to the barrel and poured it, and went back and carried another and poured it, and stood with his arms at his sides and his coat wet at the cuffs. And the barn was warm around him, 74 degrees, warm enough that the sweat from the labor did not chill. His humiliation was not being denied shelter. His humiliation was being given work. The same work that Alma had done every day since November of the previous year. The same work that Miriam and Jonah and Nell and Walter had done without complaint, without drama, without the particular agony of a man who discovers that the world he built was smaller than the world he dismissed. Honora sat on the thermal bench, the one Rowan and Alma had built together, and held her damaged hand in her lap and said nothing. The warmth came through the stone and through her skirts and into the joints that had stiffened and the skin that had scarred, and she closed her eyes. The school teacher's two students watched from the seed boxes along the south wall. They were 11 and 12, old enough to understand what they were seeing and young enough to carry it for the rest of their lives. They watched a wealthy man carry water in a house built by a woman he had evicted. They did not understand the legal architecture behind it, the quitclaim, the guardianship paper, the challenge filed in the county office. They understood the simpler thing. The man who said she would fail had come to the place she had built and done work she had assigned. That image would outlast any document. The next morning, before Matthias took Honora home, Alma did something she had not planned. She gave Honora a jar of salve, rendered tallow mixed with beeswax and dried comfrey that Miriam had taught her to prepare. For the hand, Alma said. Honora took the jar with her good hand. She held it against her chest the way a person holds something that costs nothing and is worth everything, and she walked through the vestibule and into the cold and did not drop it. Matthias brought Honora home on the road that had hardened enough to walk. 3 days later, he went to the county clerk's office and withdrew his challenge to Alma's quitclaim. He did not become kind. He did not become generous. He became beaten by fact. The coal fire under Alma's barn was a fact. The glass roof was a fact. The vent system was a fact. The 74 degrees was a fact. The lettuce and the seedlings and the liquid water and the warm cistern and the 17 households that had copied some part of the method were facts. Matthias had spent a year fighting facts with paper, and the paper had lost. His final acknowledgement came not in the barn, but in the county office, in front of the clerk who had sold Alma the quitclaim for $2 and who remembered the joke about ink. Matthias said, "The children are warm where they are." The clerk wrote it in the margin of the challenge withdrawal. He wrote it because he had been a witness to the beginning, and he wanted to be a witness to the end, and because margins are where the truth lives when the official text has run out of room. Jonah Rusk asked Alma to marry him on a Saturday in March of 1888. He did not ask during a sunset. He did not ask over a meal. He asked while replacing a roof vent hinge that had corroded, standing on the east wall with putty on his hands and a pane of glass under his arm. He said he could build frames for the rest of his life if she would let him, but the house was hers. This mattered. In 1888, marriage transferred a woman's property to her husband in most territories. Colorado had passed a Married Women's Property Act, but the law was new and the enforcement was thin, and the habit of 1,000 years was thicker than any statute. A woman who married lost control of what she owned unless the man she married chose not to take it. Jonah chose not to take it, but Alma did not trust choice. She trusted paper. She agreed to marry him after he signed a document written by Alma on the back of a feed sack, witnessed by Abel Quince and Miriam Coe, recognizing her sole title to the barn property and the greenhouse operation. The document had no legal weight that a court would honor. It had the weight of 2 witnesses and a man's name in ink, and in Langford that was heavier than most contracts. Jonah signed without hesitation. He signed the way he set glass, with steady hands and no wasted motion, and the quiet certainty of a man who knows that what he is holding is fragile, and that fragile things are worth the care they require. When Miriam asked him whether the paper bothered him, he said a house that stands because one person built it should not fall because another person signed a marriage register. Miriam repeated this at the wash line the next day, and by evening it had reached Brackett's store, where it sat among the men around the stove with the uncomfortable weight of a statement that none of them would have made and all of them recognized as true. They married in April. The school teacher read the service because the nearest minister was in Boulder and the road was mud. Nell held wildflowers. Walter held a nail because Walter was 4 and nails were his currency. Miriam stood beside Alma and Jonah stood beside the vent stack, which was the closest thing to a pillar the barn possessed, and the wool thread moved in the updraft during the vows like a small flag raised in a country no one had named yet. Jonah moved into the barn. He brought his tools, his putty recipes, and a cot that Alma replaced within the week with a proper bed frame built from milled pine he had been saving in the railroad shed. Their courtship had been practical. He respected the design before he touched her hand. Their marriage was the same. He built, she directed. They argued about pitch angles and putty mixtures, and whether the south vents should open outward or inward, and the arguments were the healthiest sound the barn had heard since Rowan's cane stopped tapping on the stone. The years compressed the way years do when the crisis is over and the living begins. By 1889, the warm house had a proper door, oak, hung on iron hinges Jonah forged at the railroad shop. The vestibule doubled in size. The glass roof lost and gained panes with the seasons, a constant negotiation between weather and repair that Jonah managed with the patience of a man who had made his peace with fragile materials. By 1890, Alma and Jonah had a daughter. They named her Eleanor, after no one, a new name for a new life that did not owe its shape to the dead or the distant. Eleanor was born in the warm house, on the thermal bench, on a night in February when the temperature outside was 9 degrees and the temperature inside was 71. The midwife said she had never delivered a child in winter without shivering and that she would like to deliver all future children in this room. Nell grew into a girl who kept a thermometer in her pocket the way other children kept string or stones. She read Rowan's notebook at night, tracing the sketches with her finger, asking Alma what Braddis meant and why air mattered and what happened in the Rhonda. By 12, she could read the inspection channels faster than Alma. By 14, she announced she would become a teacher because the thing she liked best was explaining something to someone who did not yet understand it, and the thing she liked second best was watching their face when they did. Walter apprenticed with the railroad at 16. He was good with iron and better with schedules, and best of all at arriving places on time, which was a skill his mother had taught him without intending to. Every winter he came home and checked the vent stack. He climbed the east wall and tapped the pipe the way Rowan had tapped the vent box, listening for the sound that meant solid and the sound that meant crack. He replaced the clay seal twice. He never failed to check the threads. There was a night in the winter of 1892 when a miner's wife named Berta Svensson came to the warm house at 2 a.m. with a child who could not breathe. The child was 18 months old, and the croup had closed his throat to a whistle, and Berta had carried him a quarter-mile through snow because the warm, moist air inside the barn was the nearest thing to the steam treatment the doctor in Boulder would have prescribed if the doctor in Boulder had been reachable and if Berta could have paid him. Alma opened the door. She hung wet cloths near the floor where the heat turned water to vapor, and she held the child upright on the thermal bench while Berta sat beside her and rocked and counted breaths the way Alma had once counted Nell's. By dawn, the whistle had opened to a rasp. By noon, the rasp had opened to a cry. Berta took her child home alive and brought Alma a sack of turnips 2 days later, which was everything Berta had. This was the warm house, not a building, a function. The place people came when the cold or the sickness or the math of winter exceeded what their own walls could manage. Alma did not charge for emergencies. She charged for seedlings and labor and cut greens and the designs she drew on bark and feed sacks for people who wanted to build their own versions of what she had built. The coal seam was hers alone. No one could replicate it, and no one should try without the knowledge Rowan had given her. But the principles were universal. Stone holds heat. Glass admits light. Venting keeps the air clean. Double doors keep the warmth in. These were lessons anyone could use, and Alma gave them freely because knowledge that stays in one house dies when the house does. Jonah built glass frames for 7 other households over the following years. He adapted the warm house design for buildings that did not sit over coal fires, using south-facing glass, stone heat walls, and the same airlock vestibule to trap warmth in spaces that had previously lost it through every door opening. His frames were not Alma's invention. They were the translation of Alma's invention into a language that buildings without burning ground could speak. The Hale Warm House, the names settled onto the barn, the way names settle onto places, without ceremony, without a sign, just through repetition, until the words and the place became the same thing, started cabbage, lettuce, onions, and medicinal herbs weeks before any neighboring garden could break ground. It sheltered sick children during cold snaps because Alma never locked the door and never turned anyone away and never forgot what a locked door had felt like from the outside. It warmed wash water in the cistern barrel and provided seedlings to 17 households in the first year and more in the years after. Alma did not sell the coal fire as magic. She sold seedlings, cut greens, and designs for safer south wall cold frames, and she charged what people could pay, which was sometimes money and sometimes labor, and sometimes a chicken and once a Bible she did not need but accepted because the woman who offered it had nothing else. The town stopped calling the barn the Devil's Cowshed. The name died the way most insults die, not through retraction but through irrelevance. The barn was no longer a curiosity or scandal. It was a fact of the town's geography, as fixed as the creek and the rail siding and the road to Boulder. Children pressed their hands to the warm stone on cold days and listened for the fire they could not see, the way children press ears to railroad tracks and listen for trains that have not yet arrived. The fire was there. It would be there for decades, possibly centuries. It burned beneath the surface in its own time, patient and indifferent to the seasons and the people and the glass roof above it, giving heat because heat was what it had, not because anyone had asked. Abel Quince brought new widows to Alma before they signed away choices. He had changed since the January storm and the notebook and the admission in front of witnesses. He was still the poor overseer. He still carried the field book. He still counted what people had and measured it against what they needed. But the equation had changed. Before Alma, Abel's arithmetic had only one answer. Insufficient means insufficient. After Alma, the arithmetic allowed for a variable he had never included, which was the possibility that a person with nothing could build something from the nothing if the nothing happened to sit over the right piece of ground, and the person happened to have the right piece of knowledge. This was not optimism. Abel did not do optimism. It was a revised formula, and Abel trusted formulas the way he trusted numbers, reluctantly but completely once the evidence supported them. He brought widows to the warm house and let them stand inside and feel the air and see the greens and the sleeping children and the wool threads moving in their slow, constant rhythm. And then he told them this woman had $2. He did not tell them it was easy. He told them it was possible. The distinction mattered more than any encouragement he could have manufactured. Miriam ran a laundry corner in the vestibule through the winters. The warm water and the warm air dried linens faster than any line in the cold, and Miriam charged 2 cents more per bundle for winter wash, because the quality was worth it, and because Alma had taught her that value is not charity when it is earned by labor and design. Jonah built. Alma directed. The children grew. Sauce. Years later, enough years that the coal camp had changed its name twice, and the railroad had changed hands, and the drift called Number 7 had been sealed and abandoned, and the sandstone walls of the barn had darkened from cream to the color of strong tea. Honora Hale came to the warm house without Matthias. Matthias had died the previous winter. Heart failure, the doctor from Boulder said. Failure of the heart. Alma thought there were several kinds of failure that word could describe and chose not to say so. Honora was older now and quieter, and the glove she wore over her damaged hand had become so much a part of her that the children in town believed she had been born with them. She came to the barn alone, which meant she had walked, which meant the walk mattered enough to take without the carriage her husband's estate still maintained. She sat on the thermal bench, the same bench. The stone had been repaired twice, and the mortar replaced once, and the surface worn smooth by a decade of children and herbs and quilts, and the particular friction of people living against stone. Honora looked at the glass roof, where the panes had been replaced so many times that no two adjacent pieces were the same shade of green. She looked at the orange nasturtiums climbing a soot-polished wall, the wall Alma had scraped with a flat stone the day Matthias rode up on his horse and called the barn a grave. She did not apologize in grand language. Grand language would have been an insult to the years between the question she had asked on the Hale porch and the bench she sat on now. She said, "I thought warmth belonged to houses like mine." Alma said, "Warmth belongs where someone knows how to keep it." They sat for a while. The glass roof filtered the light into something green and soft. The nasturtiums climbed. The wool thread at the vent pulled outward. The fire beneath them did what it had always done, which was burn without caring who sat above it, giving heat to anyone who had learned where the heat was trying to go. By the time the coal camp at Langford began its slow fade, the seam thinning, the railroad rerouting, the miners drifting west toward newer strikes, at least 17 households had learned from Alma. Not the dangerous part, not the coal seam foundation that required a dead Welshman's knowledge and a widow's willingness to gamble. The usable part, south-facing glass, stone mass, venting, double doors, early seed beds warmed by the ground they grew from. The warm house became the place where people brought cracked panes and broken thermometers and questions they did not know how to ask, and left with answers that smelled like lime wash and warm soil. Alma lived the rest of her life on the strip of ground the town had valued at $2. She died in the early 20th century, the exact year compressed by time the way all exact years are compressed when the person who lived them is gone, and the people who remember them are old. Her children kept Rowan's notebook in a tin box, wrapped in the quit-claim deed that Matthias had failed to break. Nell became the teacher she had promised to become and kept a thermometer in her classroom window every winter, checking it each morning the way her mother had checked the inspection channels, not because the number changed the day, but because knowing the number meant the day could not surprise her. The sleet came back every November. The silver dollars, long spent, lived only in the story. The Hale door, the real Hale door, the one with 3 cast-iron stoves behind it, had closed on Alma with a question. Which child will you leave first? The town had called the answer a cowshed. The devil's cow shed, they said, and they laughed the way people laugh when they see something they do not understand and choose ridicule because ridicule is cheaper than curiosity. Snow falls on the glass roof at night. It falls the way it has always fallen, without agenda, without malice, the ordinary weight of winter pressing against whatever stands beneath it. At the lower panes where the stone walls hold the earth's heat closest to the surface, the snow softens. It melts. It runs in silver lines down the black stone and pools at the foundation, and the pool does not freeze because the ground remembers what it was given and gives it back. Inside, a child sleeps without boots. A kettle steams without a stove fire. Bean vines climb their strings in February, and beyond the wall, deep beneath the floor, the hidden earth burns in its own time, giving back what others threw away. The ruin did not save Alma because it was warm. It saved her because she learned where the warmth was trying to go,